Hi, welcome to our second online lecture. Today's topic is kinship, family, and marriage. So we wrapped up our last topic on exchange and wealth in different types of societies. And we started this topic on our last day of face-to-face classes, namely kinship and kinship diagrams. So in the US, we recognize family in one way, and that might be different for other people in other places around the world. So, for example, you might have a biological relative, let's say your father's brother, that you consider an uncle. That same exact relationship biologically may exist in other cultures, but that person might not be considered family at all. And so the way in which kinship is constructed is cultural and social, even if it seems to us like it's simply biological. So we'll talk a bit more about that. There's a few reasons we're discussing kinship, and one is different kinship patterns underlie different marriage patterns we see around the world. And so remember, in anthropology, everything's interconnected. Marriage systems, politics, kinship, they don't exist in a vacuum, but are interrelated with other aspects of the culture. So one of the reasons we see such different kinship or marriage systems in other types of cultures is it's sometimes adaptive in the environment they live in. There's social, economic, environmental reasons for different marriage forms. And so we'll take a look at that today. If we were talking about this face to face, we would spend much more time. Kinship is a bit tricky to teach remotely. So the goal here is to give you the nuts and bolts of what you need to know so we can get into our discussion on marriage. Um, so with that said, don't get too bogged down in the kinship diagrams. I'll take it sort of easy on you come quiz and exam time, but you do want to sort of understand the basics of how it works so you can understand how kinship and also marriage varies. So why study kinship and marriage? And we touched on some of this before we left from our last face-to-face class. But since it's been over 2 weeks, I'm going to go ahead and just recap a bit of what we covered. And again, sort of just try to enjoy some of the interesting examples we're going to talk about. Don't get too bogged down in every single definition, although it is important. One reason we study kinship and marriage cross-culturally is marriage is part of a national debate here in the US. One side of the aisle, if you will, in the US, namely the right, sort of argues that marriage has always been this union between a man and a woman, and it's the longest, most enduring institution mankind has ever seen. From the perspective of anthropology, that's simply untrue and inaccurate. Marriage in the US, monogamy between a man and a woman, which by no means characterizes the only form of marriage in this country, especially now, that's one form of marriage. It's by no means the dominant form or the most enduring form. Monogamy is relatively recent, actually, compared to some other marriage forms like polygamy. So one reason we look at it cross-culturally is to inform this debate about how marriage should be defined. And anthropologists would say you can't really define it because it's so diverse cross-culturally. So if you define it one way, then you're not capturing it in some other society. People that are interested in sort of making these specific definitions and then applying that to humans universally, it's just simply incorrect, right? And the other reason we're going to study kinship is, unlike in our society, who is in your family, who you reckon descent from, who's in your kin group. This is a really important organizing principle. Who do you work with? Who do you cooperate with? Who do you build houses with? Who do you go to the garden with? And also, who do you marry? Who do you go to war with? Who are your allies? In our society, we have other things that do this for us, right? Our hobbies or our interests might determine who we end up working with. We have people we know from school, maybe from church if you go to church, or temple or mosque. You also have people perhaps in your neighborhood and just friends in other social circles based off what you're interested in. And so we have our hobbies, our job, our ethnic and religious affiliations to tell us sort of who to group up with. You couldn't really understand our society, people's work schedule, why they do what they do without understanding our politics, our economic system, some of these other things that influence the way we're organized. And so in that same way, you cannot understand the way other societies are organized without understanding the kinship system. Because unlike for us, the kin system is a really important organizing principle in most other societies. And so that's sort of where we'll start, and then we'll talk about marriage in the second half. And again, this is recapping. We talked about this, just refreshing your memories. So kinship and marriage are difficult to study cross-culturally because it requires we question and examine the basic structures that we grew up with. For example, we take for granted the notion that monogamy is normal and natural, or that there's only two gender roles. There's not. There's multiple gender roles. That's culturally defined. It's not biological. Sex is biological, not gender. More on that after the break. And we also assume, you care equally about your maternal or your paternal grandparents. Maybe you don't like either side of your family, but it's not predetermined. You can sort of pick and choose, or you like both. In other societies, it's very different. Monogamy is not the norm. There are more than two gender roles, numerous examples of that. And some societies, the kinship system dictates you care more about one side of the family, say your dad's or your mom's, than the other side. And so what we're sort of used to seems obvious and natural, but it doesn't hold up cross-culturally for other people. Kinship and descent, that's one way by which we can categorize people, but again, all societies do this differently, the way they categorize it, who's included. I gave you an example about the confusion that can arise when anthropologists come from their own culture trying to study another culture's kinship system. So you have your own, well, let's just take English, mom, dad, sister, brother, cousin. Those are English words, and those are English kinship terms. In other societies, if you ask someone, who's your mom, that's meaningless. That's not, they don't have the word for their mom is different. And also, when you get out into more extended family, say cousins or aunts or uncles, who you recognize as an aunt might not be the same for other groups of people, even though the biological relationship's the same. So anthropologists had to come up with abstract terms and ways to sort of diagram and label kinship. Just a quick example of how quickly things can get misconstrued. Missionaries were traveling around, and they were trying to deduce the word for mother. So they kept asking, they would know that a woman was born from another woman, and they would ask, what do you call that woman? And the people said, Amma. But they referred to multiple Ammas, not just one. The missionaries sort of deduced, well, the people are primitive and sex is loose in the society. Erroneous. But nonetheless, they probably just don't really know who their actual biological mother is, so they refer to multiple women as mother. That's not true. That's not what was happening. These people did know who their biological mother was. What was happening is Amma is a term to refer to people in the generation above. And that's why there was multiple Amma, right? It could be your mother, but your aunts, or other elder women. So again, anthropologists had to come up with abstract terms and diagrams and symbols to sort of label this stuff, where not only are the words for your kin different, but also the relationships that are important might not be the same as you move from one culture to the next. So kinship is defined. Two persons are kin to each other when they're linked by socially recognized bonds of descent or marriage or both. And it's so important, it's socially constructed. You'll see more why as we keep going. So just real quick, here's our kin diagram. Let me see if I can use a pen. So female, circle, male, triangle. That's how you symbolize males and females. Equal sign means these two are married. Vertical line is descent. So these people are descended from this couple. Horizontal line, siblingship. Son, because it's in the generation below, and daughter. Okay, but you also always have to have a reference point, because if I'm talking about labeling this as mother, say this female right here, but mother to who? That's not the mother of this person. And so you always have a focal point, a starting point, which is colored in, if you will. And it's what we call ego. And ego can be anyone. It's just who you pick to be the starting point for where you start to branch out the genealogy from, because again, mother has to be in reference to someone, or father. So let's make this ego. This would be ego's sister, this would be ego's father, and ego's mother. If the parents, let's say, they don't get along, divorce. And also, this person, say this father, probably also has some siblings. Let's say he has a brother. This would be ego's uncle, possibly ego's aunt. That's supposed to be a circle of female. And these people are probably married too, right? He's probably married, and she might be also married. But you might not always see this, okay? It doesn't mean the person's not married. They don't magically, if you see like kids coming from that one person, this woman didn't magically pop two children out via a stork. She's probably married or at least having sexual relations, but this part might not actually be included in the diagram because it gets messy, it gets confusing. So we sort of conclude what we're talking about, but we don't include everything. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay, let's keep going. And then, well, actually, let's do one more. Let's see. Let's go here. Here. So for us in English in the US, if this is ego, this is ego's father, who would these people be? And the answer is this would be ego's grandmother, paternal grandmother specifically, and grandfather, paternal grandfather specifically. Also, if we can figure out just brother, sister, father, mother, and husband and wife, then you can get to any other kinship relation that exists. Because again, we might have a word for uncle, but how do you ask another culture that defines their uncles differently and doesn't call them uncles, right? So how do you figure that out? But if you can say your mother's brother, your mother's brother's sister, your mother's brother's sister's husband's brother's children, you can get to anywhere in the genealogy with those 6 terms. Sorry, the slide skipped ahead and I can't back it up, so that's okay. We don't need to anyways. You've already seen this. This is just a picture of typical sort of U.S. family. Why are the families color-coded? Is it one big family? Is it an extended family? What we talked about in class is the colors dictate and define the nuclear families within the larger extended family. And it shows we put emphasis on the nuclear family in this country. The mother, the father, and the unmarried children. That's the nuclear family. This is the basic kinship or household unit. And think about it. Usually these people live together, pool labor, chores, money, resources. That's sort of the basic kinship unit for us is the nuclear family. And so in the U.S., our descent system is what we call bilateral, and it's thoroughly ambiguous. The Kung actually have a similar system. So bilateral means we recognize kin on both sides of the family, the paternal father and the maternal mother side. It's bilateral, both sides. It's also ambiguous, meaning we might recognize relatives on both sides. We might interact and care for our relatives on the maternal side more than the paternal side because we like them more, because we simply don't know our paternal relatives. Maybe the paternal relatives live really far away and you just don't see them as often. Or maybe you choose not to see them. The point is it's ambiguous, meaning it can be done and understood in more than one way. We can sort of pick and choose on each side who we're closer with and what not. That seems, well, who cares, right? You're telling me something I already know. But as we turn to other types of societies, you'll see how drastically different people recognize kinship and descent. And so the Kung are similar to the U.S. descent system. They're also bilateral and ambiguous. The nuclear family tends to be important. You notice this in Nisa. When she gets upset with family, she can go to another relative on her father's side or her mother's side, go stay with them, hunt and gather with them for a while. And she can kind of pick and choose, right? It's ambiguous and bilateral. She can go to either side. Nanook of the North, the film about the Nanook by Robert Flaherty. We also saw the nuclear family, Nanook, actually called Alagagialak, traveling as a unit, right? So that's sort of how that's the basic unit in this type of descent system. Again, similar to us in the Kung. So here is Eskimo kinship. Your book gives 4 kinship systems. Uh, and maybe a couple others. We're only interested in you only need to understand 2 of them. The first is the Eskimo kinship system. And why is it called the Eskimo system? This is the common type of kinship system, the way that most foragers and hunter-gatherers sort of recognize their family, their kin. And the anthropologist that first studied kinship and named all these different systems, he was studying essentially North American groups. And so the Eskimos was one of the first groups where he saw this kinship organization, so he named it after them. Eskimos are hunter-gatherers, and the system that they have, which we now just call broadly the Eskimo system, it applies to us, and it applies to the Kung. And yeah, so those are the main examples you need to know. And you notice that the terms isolate out the nuclear family. It's bilateral, so people on both sides of the family could be equally related or equally important. One side's not predefined as more important. This changes in other groups. And notice the terms sort of isolate out the nuclear family, right? So you have one term. Let me see if I can get my pen again here. What? Oh, shit. Okay, nope. That's okay. We'll go ahead and do it on this one. So this is the same idea. This is the Eskimo system, but the Kung kin terms are actually included. So here I'm just kind of boxing out the nuclear family. That's what I was trying to talk about on the last page. So this is ego. This is our focal point to which all other labels are labeled accordingly. So this is ego's father. These are actual Kung kin terms. So ba, and I won't ask you the Kung kin terms, but what you want to understand how it works. This is ego's mother, Tai. Ego's sister, Kui, and brother, Ko. Remember, siblings, parents, married. Who would this be to ego? And if you get confused, just start from ego, right? Ego's father's brother. In the US, we would call that an uncle. And for the Kung, they also consider that something similar to an uncle. Ga would be aunt. And then on the mother side, same thing. Ga for the mother, sister, the aunt, and Tu for the father. Or excuse me, the uncle, the sister's brother. So I was saying on the last slide before I accidentally skipped ahead, you can tell sort of who's important in the family, in the kin unit, based off the terms. And if there's just one term for that specific person, like there's only one term for sister, and that applies only to her for ego. That's not applied to anyone else. But as you move outward to cousins, for example, look at ego's mother's sister's children. Tun and Kuna, both cousins, one male, the other female. Also, so different names, but all cousins are called by those names, right? Whether Kuna or Tun. There's just one specific term for brother. You would only call that person brother. Same with mother and father, whereas uncles, no matter what side they're on, and aunts, they're just called by the same term. You don't know if it's paternal or maternal. So they're similar to our terms, but some differences. Let's look at the differences. You can see the similarities. Things that are different. Cousin terms, Kuna and Tun. What do we say? We just say cousin. We don't know what gender it is. The Kung differentiate via gender for that. But look at this. Suma, which is the children of ego's siblings, either ego's sister or ego's brother. Suma. In English, we don't have one term for that, but 2, right? Nieces and nephews. But in both cases, us and the Kung, the terms isolate out the nuclear family. So you can tell that that's an important type of kinship unit. There's specific terms for each of those people. Okay, some terms for you, basic definitions. Consanguines are your blood relatives. These are people you're related to by birth, that you share DNA with, related by blood. Your mother, your father, your siblings, your paternal grandfather, your sister's children. Affines are people related by marriage. So your in-laws, right? That's what we call them in the U.S. So you're related to them in law via marriage, but not by blood. They're still part of your family, but you're not genetically related to them. So, for example, my mother's brother's wife, my aunt, she would be an Affine because it's my mother's brother is my uncle that shares blood, and even though she's my aunt, she's from another lineage, if you will. My sister's fiance would also be an Affine. My sister and her fiance's children would be my consanguines, right? Related by blood because me and my sister share DNA. Descent. So there's two main types of descent that you need to know. The first is bilateral. We've been talking about this. It's the system we have and the Kun. Bilateral meaning kin can be recognized on both the paternal and or maternal side of the family, either or both. It's not predefined. In contrast, unilineal descent, only one side of the family is predefined as more important, either the paternal, the father's side, or the maternal, the mother's side, but not both. It's one or the other that is more important in terms of who you recognize as your kin. Two types of unilineal descent. Patrilineal, this is when kinship is recognized, descent is recognized through the male line, the father's line. We'll look at some examples here in a minute. And then matrilineal descent. Kinship relatedness is traced through the mother's line, through the females. One side or the other, not both. One is more important than the other, depending on the society. And then there's two kinship systems we'll talk about. One, the Eskimo, remember, bilateral, characterizes us and the Kun. We just looked at that. And the other is a unilineal descent system known as the Iroquois. And again, Lewis Henry Morgan, the guy that studied this stuff, he was doing work in North America. All the groups that he came into contact with were Native American groups that represented these different types of kinship. And so he named the kinship systems after the first group he founded it. So Eskimo system is bilateral, and this unilineal, patrilineal system we're going to look at is called Iroquois. That's just where the terms come from. So it comes from a specific culture, but the kinship system applies to lots of societies around the world. Eskimo system is typical among foragers. The Iroquois system is typical among patrilineal societies. So remember, bilateral, us, the Kun. Both sides can count, or neither, or one or the other, but it's up to you. It's up to the circumstances. It's not predefined. It's ambiguous. It can be done in more than one way. In contrast, unilineal descent systems, only one side of the family is predefined as more important. They're considered more immediate relatives in contrast to the other side. So in patrilineal descent systems, for social purposes of labor, of marriage, of inheriting property, for social purposes, you're the child of your father. In matrilineal descent, for social purposes, living together, child rearing, working together as a household unit, you are the child of your mother. And so descent ends up producing communities that are divided up into these kin groups. So different villages, communities are made up of multiple kin groups. And it's through the kinship system that people figure out who to marry. For example, often the incest taboos are somewhat universal. Most people don't marry their immediate relatives, with very few exceptions. And so someone immediately in your patriline or kin group, you're not going to marry, right? You're going to marry typically into another kin group. We'll get there when we get there. Who do you cooperate with, right? Who owns property? Who inherits property? This is transmitted through lines of descent, through kinship. And so it's really important to be able to trace your kinship for survival purposes, right? So you can inherit land or property or resources or pool labor with others. Again, in the U.S., for us, it's what we're interested in, or what our religious or our political affiliation, that sort of tells us where we go, what we do, who we spend time with. In other societies, it's the kinship system that does that. You really can't understand how they're organized without understanding the kin system. Okay, so let me try this again. I just talked for 10 minutes explaining it, and then I jumped the slide ahead too quickly. So this is a unilineal patrilineal kinship system called the Iroquois kinship system. It characterizes lots of patrilineal societies. We'll look at one, the Yanomamo, in a minute. But for now, we'll just look at the general patrilineal kin system, again called the Iroquois, because all the different kinship systems are named after North American groups where they were first found. So even though it has a specific cultures term, it applies to multiple different societies that resemble this same kinship system. And sorry if I'm repeating a few things that I said on the last slide. Again, the presentation got kind of screwed up. So starting again on this slide, we have to have a focal point, right? So here's ego, our focal point, and always shaded in, right? Over here's the key, triangle male, circle female. Ego is always the focal point, colored in. And then we have English terms just so we can understand what we're saying. Whatever the language is in the culture, they would have their own term for mother, father, grandmother. They wouldn't have English terms for that. But we're going to use English terms for us so we can understand the kin relations. So in patrilineal societies, the most important kinship unit is not the nuclear family like it is for us, the parents and the unmarried children. Rather, it's the patriline. Remember, in patrilineal societies, kin group membership descent is traced through the male line. So let's go through this. Pay attention. Let's try and break it down. Here's ego, your focal point, because father in relation to who? This is ego's father, but this is not the father of, say, this person, right? So we have to have a focal point that we're referencing. Look at this. Yeah. Okay. So ego's father. Ego's the child of his father and his mother. So years back, before ego's father was married, this female, ego's mother, she belonged to a different patriline. She belonged to the patriline of her father that she was born into, ego's maternal grandfather. When she came of age and decided, to get married, or rather the villages decided to go ahead and help arrange a marriage, she married this man and therefore married into his patriline. So she married out of her own patriline of birth and into ego's father's patriline. Then they had children, one of which was ego and also ego's sister, shown here. Okay, so remember, the most important relationships traced through the males. It doesn't mean females aren't relatives, but cooperation, inheritance, things like that, property inheritance, are transferred through the kin line, through the descent line. And in the case of patrilineal society, that's traced through the male. So here's ego's father. And also in this patriline, ego's patriline, is ego's father's brother. Notice, though, it's not uncle. This individual is also called father. So ego's father and ego's father's brother is also father. Now, in this culture, whatever culture we're talking about, they wouldn't say father, but what they're showing you is that ego has the same term, father, or whatever the term is, and calls this person, the uncle, also by father. It implies that this person is important, right? Okay, and so then ego's aunt, she used to belong to a different patriline, but she grew up and she married this guy, who's ego's father's brother, who he calls father, married this guy, and she now belongs to ego's patriline too, right? Through this marriage to ego's, what we would call uncle, what they would call father. Notice also the children born of this union, they're what we call parallel cousins. There's two types of cousins, parallel and cross cousins. Look at the sibling, look at the terms for what ego calls these people. What do you call, so ego's father's brother, also called father. What do you call the children of your father? You call them brother and sister, right? They are your brothers and sisters. And so likewise, in this system, ego calls these people by sibling terms, sister and brother. Father, sister and brother. Okay, these people are also in ego's patriline. Parallel cousins, these parallel cousins, the children of ego's father's brother, are in the same patriline. They're in the same kin unit, and they would never marry. It would be considered incest, and it just wouldn't do it. In the same way we have a similar taboo, at least a lot of areas in the US does. Okay, Ego's father's sister, she does not belong to Ego's father's patriline any longer. She grew up, she used to, she came from the same patriline as Ego's father, started by Ego's paternal grandfather, who married Ego's grandmother. She herself came from some other patriline, right? Married into this one. They had children, Ego's father's brother, also called father, and Ego's sister, called father's sister, or whatever the term it would be for them. But note, father, sister, and married to what Ego would call her uncle. Don't worry about that. She is not in the patriline. She is married into this guy's patriline now. And the kids born of this union, therefore, also belong to this guy's patriline. And so they're cross cousins in contrast to the parallel cousins. Parallel cousins are in Ego's patriline. Cross cousins are not. They belong to the patriline this guy's a part of. Okay, flip over to the maternal side. Ego's mother, who's in Ego's patriline because she's married in. Over here you have Ego's mother's sister, also called mother to Ego. Implies this person is also of special importance to Ego. Note that the male is not called father, right? The mother's sister's husband is just an uncle, so not the same importance as the paternal uncle, the father's brother. So the mother's sister married this guy called uncle. And again, what do you call the children of your mother? Brother and sister. And so there's another set of parallel cousins. So the first set, these parallel cousins are in the patriline, and you wouldn't marry within the patriline. It would be incest, and they don't do it. These parallel cousins are not in the patriline, but they're another type of family that you also wouldn't marry. However, these cross cousins, who belong to the patriline that Ego's father's sister has married into, they belong to a different kin unit, and also Ego's mother's brother, who is married and has children, he belongs to the patriline that the mother used to. But when she married Ego's father, she left that patriline. She's now part of Ego and Ego's father's patriline. And so the mother's brother, the children of this union, belong to the mother's brother patriline, not Ego and the mother's patriline. These are another type of cross cousins. Okay, so hopefully you followed some of that. And what's important is parallel cousins are family either in the patriline or another type of family that's important, and you would never marry them. However, in certain villages among a group called the Yanomamo, cross cousins are desirable marriage partners because they're not in the family. It's not considered incest, and it helps. It's a benefit for the village for reasons I'll touch on. So in many societies, kind of globally, the bond, kinship, the social bond is seen as running only through the male line. And what I mean by that is patrilineal societies, that's the dominant form. About 60% of societies that have existed, not people, right, but of different types of societies that have existed, about 60% of them have a form of unilineal descent, not bilateral, not the type of kinship and descent that we're used to, that we've grown up with, that seems normal and natural to us. 60% are unilineal. Of that 60%, about a third are matrilineal. That's fairly a lot more unique compared to patrilineal, and about 70% of them are patrilineal. Only about 40% of all societies are bilateral, recognize kin as equally important on both sides of the family. So these principles of descent create extremely interesting marriage arrangements. And that is where we're headed for the second half of this lecture. That'll sort of wrap things up for kinship. Now let's go ahead and get into marriage. And understanding the kinship system is really important for understanding why we see very interesting marriage patterns. The example I want to start with comes from the Nayar. They're a pastoral group in Sudan in Africa, meaning they subsist off herd animals, namely cattle. And the Nayar practice something called ghost marriage. So the Nayar are a unilineal society, patrilineal to be specific. They perceive the social bond and trace it as running through the males in the family. And so the patriline, rather than say the nuclear family, that's the main kin unit, main sort of economic and social unit. So what happens in Nayar marriage is when you marry, say you're a Nayar female and you marry a man, when you marry that man, you leave your own patriline of birth and enter into his patriline. You now belong to that kin group. And within the patriline, that's where property, inheritance, cattle, wealth, cooperation, all these other things that are inherited and passed down through the male line. So the wealth, the resources that belong to the family, they don't belong to the husband and wife and the children, like say maybe in the US. They belong to the patriline. So the father, the unmarried or married sons, the father's brothers, and the father's father, the grandfather, and so on. The male lines and all the women that have married those men and had children have joined that patriline. Okay, so in Nayar ghost marriage, because wealth is passed down through the patriline, this can happen a couple different ways. One thing that will happen is if a female is married and she has children and she belongs to her husband's patriline, if the husband dies, a woman will often marry the dead man, the deceased groom, her dead husband. She will marry his ghost. The ghost isn't physically there. It's a symbolic marriage, right? She'll marry the ghost. And then sometimes also, if possible, the brother of the deceased groom will serve as a stand-in for the groom, so that the female, the bride, the widow, who's now married to the ghost of her deceased husband, can have more children if she wants to with the brother. The brother has his own wife, but it's custom, it's tradition. The brother can stand in and serve as sort of a substitute, help the wife out, help take care of her kids, and also have more children with her. Why marry the ghost? Why is this so important, right? Why not just skip that part? Why it's so important is the ghost marriage to the deceased husband keeps the female connected to the patriline she's married into. Remember, the wealth, the cattle, the children, they don't belong to her and the husband. They belong to the patriline, the male kin of the husband. So the husband dies and the female is no longer married in, connected to that patriline. All the wealth, all her stuff, and her kids stay with the patriline. They belong to the patriline, the kin group, not sort of the wife. Therefore, the female will marry a ghost to symbolically stay tied into the patriline. Why bother to have the brother serve as a stand-in? Maybe she wants to have more children, right? This brings people to take care of you in old age. It's economic security. It's social security. It's your kids. So that could be one reason. Also, the brother is likely helping contribute to resources and take care of the kids that are already born. So you can see how the patrilineal descent, how that influences inheritance and the way people relate to each other can result in these really interesting marriage patterns, like ghost marriage. There's a couple other different ways that it can play out. Well, no, let's just back up. Sorry. Another thing that can happen is say a woman is really wealthy. She comes from a wealthy patriline. And instead of marrying into a less wealthy patriline and her children and whatever she brings to it now belonging to this sort of lesser patriline, she can choose to marry a dead person, a ghost of high status, and therefore stay in her own patriline. Because she's symbolically married, she can also, she can sometimes take on a female husband, if you will. This is so much easier to explain in person when I can answer your questions. Take on a female as a symbolic husband. Other males will have sexual relationships with that female, the sort of symbolic husband. The children born from that belong to the wealthy woman who's married the substitute husband female who can actually bear children. This is if the wealthy woman's barren, right? So she'll marry a ghost and have someone else have children for her, but because she's symbolically tied into her own patriline through the ghost marriage, the children and any wealth resulting from then belong to her in the patriline that she's tied to. Hopefully that kind of makes some sense. Some of the questions I get, well, what if there's no brother? Then that's not an option. If there's no brother to serve as a stand-in, she might still marry the ghost to stay tied into the patriline, but having the brother serve as a stand-in to have more children with just isn't an option. So like all examples we'll talk about with marriage patterns, this is a possibility. It doesn't mean everyone in the society has to get married this way, but it's options that exist because of other things going on in the culture, right? You can start to see how kinship and marriage and environment and property and inheritance and all these things are actually tied together and influence one another. So Nayar ghost marriage, right? Keeps the wealth and the children in the patriline. Say she didn't marry the ghost. Her husband dies, and instead of marrying the ghost, she decides to marry some other cute guy down the way. What happens to the children and the wealth? It stays in her deceased husband's patriline. It does not go with her. So she might be marrying into lesser status. Plus, she's leaving her kids behind, which, most of us don't want to do that, right? That's not ideal. So it's a way sort of around that. It's a way to stay tied to the patriline, to keep the wealth, the children intact, and still be part of that. Another example I have for you is Nayar marriage. And this involves, unlike patrilineal, this is a matrilineal descent society. So the social bond, the kin group is recognized and traced through the females in the family, the maternal line, rather than the paternal. And so the Nayar are we're talking about pre-colonial and colonial India. So going back a few hundred years, Nayar are of the warrior caste in Hinduism in India. So the caste system, you're born into different social strata, warrior, below that, untouchables. I'm not going to ask you about it, but it's a ranked social organization. So once you're born into it, that's where you stay. And so the Nayar they're a warrior caste, which means the males were often away fighting. They're away from home a lot. They're not there often. Because the males, the fathers, are often gone, this has implications for the way the society has organized itself. Sort of a materialist approach, right? How does the system reflect adaptation? And so what happens in Nayar marriage? Again, the Nayar warrior caste, pre-colonial India, the males are often gone. And so what will happen, I just popped up the rest of the slide, but we'll get to that in a sec, is every few years when there's different villages, every few years when females are coming of age in a specific village, they'll have a ceremony and join all the girls and the women that are coming of age together and ceremonially marry them to men from other kin groups and other villages. This helps create ties between villages and kin groups within. And so this is the bride and this is the groom. This is Nayar marriage. They'll have a ceremony. The groom that has been picked or whatever that's going to marry the bride ties a golden ornament around her neck. The couple then go to a secluded place for maybe 3 days. They might have sexual relations. They might not. They're not required to. It depends on probably the people, if they like each other, if they're interested or not. And then after that 3-day period, they might never see each other ever again. That's the husband and the wife, which is not typically how we think of a husband-wife relationship, right? Again, marriage varies greatly cross-culturally. And so what happens after this ceremonial marrying of the females? And the reason the ceremony is done, it sort of signifies the females have come of age. They can now have sexual liaisons with other males in the village. They're sort of considered, it's now considered appropriate. The females don't live with the groom. She might never even see him again. In fact, the only obligation that the woman has to the groom is when he dies, her and the children, her children, not his, her and the children do a small sort of ritual. And that's it. That's the only obligation. They might never see each other again. So after the marriage, if you can call it that, which you can, it just doesn't fit the definition you hear in the Western world. The female goes back and continues to live with their kin group in their household of birth. Remember, it's matrilineal, so the mother's sisters, and their unmarried children all live together in the same unit. So females continue to live with their own kin group, and at this time, they'll start to receive male visitors, other males unrelated that come and they have sex and maybe have children. But the male visitor also is not considered the father or a husband. They simply are visitors that have sexual relationships. It might be sort of long-term or compassionate or romantic, or maybe not. It just depends on the people. The sexual partners don't live together, and they don't raise the offspring together either. The offspring of these liaisons actually belong to the woman and her matrilineal kin group. Her and her children aren't supported by the husband, the groom. They're not supported by the male visitors. They are supported by her brothers, the maternal sons of her kin group. And so they're sort of like the father, if you will, the brothers of these females who live in their matrilineal kin group. Now, they're taking care of their sister's children. They're sort of the father figure, providing resources and other things. At the same time, these brothers are going out visiting other females, right? Having relationships with them, but not taking care of their kids. They have no obligation to do that. Their obligation is to take care of their sister's children, right? Their matrilineal, the offspring in their matriline. That is the family unit. And so it's the brothers, the sisters and their children, and the maternal kin that live together. The marriage doesn't establish a nuclear family. The two might never even see each other again. They don't have kids together. They don't pool resources together, and they don't have exclusive access to the children. The children don't belong to the man at all. He's not even the one that fathered them. So it's not what many think of when they think of the typical Western definition of marriage. Oh, and one other note. I mentioned at the beginning they're matrilineal, and the Nayar warrior caste, men are absent often. They're off fighting battle. So it would make sense that you'd see a social organization, a society set up where the basic economic unit, the household, is the maternal kin and their children. So when the men are gone, imagine if it was just the nuclear family, the husband and wife and the children, and then the men are gone, 80% of the time. It'd be very difficult to take care of the kids, to tend to the fields, to do whatever you have to do. And so an adaptation to the frequent absence of men, one way to look at it is this matrilineal descent and marriage form that we see here. So that even if the men are gone all the time, the women live together. They're the basic household unit. And so they're still able to sort of continue on even with men being frequently absent, because that's not what the basic household unit is organized around. Hopefully that makes some sense. And again, if you have questions, jump on the discussion board, email me, let me know. It's really interesting stuff. So what is marriage anyways? The traditional definition in the Western sense, at least some would say, marriage is a union between a man and a woman such that the children born to the woman are the recognized legitimate offspring of both partners. So in other words, it's between a man and a woman, and the children belong to that man and that woman, right? That's sort of the definition. Is this accurate? Does this define Nayar marriage? Does this define Nayar marriage? No. No, it's one specific marriage form, not the earliest, not the longest, and not the most prominent. It does not define marriage by any means. Famous anthropologist Edmund Leach, he said, really, marriage, he defined it as a bundle of rights. Marriage is a bundle of culturally determined rights. Who the kids belong to. It might not be the husband and wife. It might be the patriline or the matriline. All universal definitions, therefore, of marriage are in vain. you really can't do it. Again, think of trying to make a definition that captures both the traditional Christian definition of marriage among some people in the U.S. and also captures Nayar and Newware marriage. Right? Who do the kids belong to? To the ghost, to the patriline, to the mother and the father? Um, what about in Nayar marriage, right? Do the kids belong to the brother? Yeah, and the answer is yes, or the groom, or the sexual partner. I mean, so again, it varies so much for different reasons in different societies that really it's a bundle of culturally determined rights. The culture determines what it is in each context. Universal definitions just don't work. Again, for example, the rights not to even to the children might not belong to the husband and the wife. Very different from how we conceive of it. So marriage, the point, almost always needs to be defined in each social context because the meaning of it varies in different societies for different reasons. In a great many other societies, marriage is typically seen as too important to be left up to just the two people that are getting married. We're used to it being an individual choice between two people. Your parents or your friends might not like who you're marrying, but that's about the extent, right? They'll still let you get married in general. In other societies, marriage is an immense economic and social rearrangement. And it doesn't just affect the husband and the wife, but it affects many relationships in the kin group and even possibly the village. And everyone that's affected by that marriage wants to have a say in it, right? So you see sort of people marrying for love, yay, guys, happy, at least for now. And then arranged marriage, right? Being sort of pushed into it by all these people. But actually, there's a lot reasons for arranged marriage. So, what is the basis of our marriages here in the U.S.? And again, sort of oversimplifying, but so for the sake of getting through the lecture, why do we get married? Is it because you love your partner? Are you going to marry someone because it will ensure financial stability for your family and the other family? Are you going to marry someone because it will give you more financial benefits than being single? Is it because your parents approve of the partner or some other reason or a combination of a few of those? And so usually I like to pull the class, and in all my classes, I get a lot of hands raised for different things, but definitely always a lot for love, right? Because we love the person and soulmates, right? Romance. I mean, this crap is so built, not crap, it's cool, but it's built into our culture so much that we never really question love as a basis for marriage. Of course, that's why we get married, for love. Um, this other guy, Good, talks about something called the romantic love complex. He said this is part of our culture here in the US. We heroify it, this idea of the romantic lover as a hero, right? Dirty Dancing, Nobody Puts Baby in the Corner, and Pretty Woman. And I know there's probably some more recent examples we could use, but it's built into film, to literature, to art, right? We heroify it, this idea of the romantic lover. For so many people around the world, this is an absolutely fucking bizarre reason to get married. Love? What are you talking about? You're gonna get married for emotions that change? um, a lot of societies, a lot more societies get married for reasons other than love, even though to us it seems so obvious and normal and natural. And don't, hey, I'm still getting married for love. But again, it's not the dominant or the norm. Again, one of the greatest strengths of anthropology is it can help make the familiar, what seems so normal to us, a little more strange, a little more exotic, and the exotic, what seems odd to us, seem a little more familiar, make a little more sense. From Peoples and Bailey, according to the textbook, U.S. Census data indicates the majority of households in the U.S. consist of a married couple and their children. True or false? And the answer is false, right? Only about 48%. Let's do this. Oh, well, false. Only about 48% of couples in the U.S. consist of a married couple and their children. right? Others are single parent households or other, right? So that even though we say that's sort of the way we do it, the majority of our households in our country don't even look like that. Let's talk about romantic love versus arrangement for just a moment. 90% of human societies, not people, but different human societies throughout time and space, base marriage on a principle other than love. Love has nothing to do with it for many other societies. They base it off other reasons. And it's ironic. In the US, in industrial societies, they've become more bureaucratic, more rational and efficient. And yet, the heart of our marriage system has become progressively more impulsive, based off these irrational emotions like love. Again, I'm going to marry for love, but it's an emotion. It's not based on reason. It's by definition not based off reason. It's an emotion. And so we base our marriages off these emotions that have little to do with money, at least in theory, right? There's a lot of other reasons people get married, not just for love. Again, that seems like a silly reason to many people. That's just weird. People in other places get married to build alliances, to create economic security for themselves, their family, for others, to cooperate. And we'll look at a few examples here in a minute. And we marry for love, but if you look, divorce rates, for first marriage, divorce rates in the US are just a little over 50%. That means less than half of couples make it. For people that have been married twice, the divorce rate goes up to like 65%. And for people on their third marriage, the divorce rate is about 74%. So yeah, we marry for love, but for how long, right? If you look at, it does level out as people get older. So once they're out of their 20s and kind of in their 30s, the divorce rate drops quite a bit, down to, I think, below 10%. I'm sure it depends on when and where we talk about. If you look at divorce rates in India, where arranged marriage is much more prevalent, their divorce rate is 1 in 1,000, right? That's less than 0.1% of their marriages that end in divorce. So there's different forms of marriage. Monogamy is what many of us are familiar with in the US. This is the idea of one partner can have one other partner. So one spouse to the other spouse, one husband or one wife. This is in contrast to polygamy. One spouse can have multiple partners. So one female can be married to multiple men, or one man can be married to multiple females. Polygamy is the general term for multiple spouses, not just one partner per person. There's two types of polygamy. So polygyny, one man, multiple females, and then polyandry, which is one female who marries multiple males. And polyandry has only been documented in maybe 12 societies, so it's extremely rare compared to polygyny or other marriage systems, but it does exist. You can find polygyny, one male, multiple females among the Yanomamo, who we'll discuss more in a moment, this group in South America, and lots of other societies practice polygyny. Your textbook, I'd refer you to your textbook for reasons why. One explanation given is societies that have a lot of conflict, a lot of warfare, more men die in conflict, and so one way around this sex ratio imbalance is polygyny. One male can marry multiple wives. And so that way all females can still have a husband, even though a lot of them die in battle. That's just one explanation. It's not monolithic. It doesn't explain all cases. It's just one. Polyandry, one female married to multiple males. This is fairly rare. Again, exists in about 12 societies. Some examples come from the Eastern Inuit, Eskimos, and also from Tibet. And so I'll give you, your book talks about polyandry in Tibet. And in this sort of high elevation mountainous regions, there's a group there that practices polyandry. And it's not just polyandry, but it's the female will marry brothers. So the reason for this, it's sort of a materialist approach. It reflects them adapting to the environment they live in. So in this area, they farm, but because it's really mountainous and rocky, the terrain is not great for farming. It's difficult terrain. Each time when children, they get married, and they usually get an inheritance, or they're allowed to work their family's land, or their family gives them a piece of land to start their own family with. And so in this area, let's say there's three brothers. If each brother gets a third of the land, again, it's already fragmented. It's already difficult to get enough crops out of it. Each brother gets a third, and then in the next generation, they have to split up that third to their three sons, further dividing it, and so on. In a couple of generations, the pieces of land that everyone has are so small, so fragmented, that you can't even grow enough food to feed yourself on it. So an adaptation, a way around this problem, is all the brothers in a family will marry one woman. So now they all still get married, they still have access to a female, but the land stays intact because they're marrying as a group. The land doesn't get divided up between the three of them, but stays with all three of them, who then marry into this arrangement with another female. And then when they have children, and so on. And so it keeps the land from being broken up. They marry as a group of brothers to one woman so that the land isn't divided amongst them, which would, over a generation or two, no one would be able to sort of sustain themselves. Again, fairly rare, but interesting. There's reasons why things are different. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not just some strange idea people came up with, right? Well, sometimes it is, like in some of the definitions that fly around in this country, like the Christian definition. Okay, in some societies, you can tell who you're going to marry by the kinship system. So remember, I was saying kinship's an important organizing principle. And so there's a couple other key examples we're going to look at, and then we'll wrap it up for the day. So hang in there. So the Yanomamo are a group in South America, and they have rules known to anthropologists as, well, we call them prescriptive marriage rules. And prescriptive means who you are supposed to marry, who you should marry. Prescriptive, it's prescribed to you. You know by the kinship system who you're supposed to marry. So the Yanomamo, also the Yanomami, don't worry about it. It's sort of like saying American versus Americans, okay? The Yanomami, plural, they live along the Venezuelan and Brazilian border in South America, mostly in the Amazon, in the tropics. They're one of the largest indigenous populations in the Amazon, numbering over 20,000. So it's not one united group, but they're broken up, this indigenous group's broken up into several different villages and regional groups. They're horticulturalists, namely gardening. They also hunt. They have a very rich cosmology. Their religious or beliefs and practices in the supernatural, what you would call religion, revolves around shamanism and also hallucinogen use, which we'll talk about magic and religion and witchcraft here after the spring break. And they are also well known, characterized by having very high levels of violence and intergroup conflict between different Yanomami villages. And so if you're a conflict-ridden people, you fight a lot, it's helpful to be able to call upon your people in your village to help you with fighting. You have more warriors, your chances are going to be better. And in order to expand their ally base even further, they have a strategy known as exogamous marriage. And so exogamy means that you are marrying outside the group, exo. Now, the group's always relative, right? So if I'm talking about a village and we say they married exogamously, it would mean someone married outside that village, outside that group. If we were talking about a village and we said someone married endogamously into the village, that would mean they married within the village, right? Within that group. So exogamy first, marriage outside the group. What Yanomamo will do is it's helpful to be able to call upon other groups, other villages to help you when you're fighting. And so they create alliances through exchange, essentially. What happens is they'll start trading with other Yanomamo groups. And if no fights break out, then they'll hold reciprocal feasts for one another. And again, if no fights break out, they'll actually exchange women in the form of intermarriage between the villages. So women from the one village will marry into the other and vice versa. And it creates an alliance, a marriage alliance between the villages. It connects them via kinship. So when the Yanomamo go to war or to battle, they can call upon not only their own village, but also these other allied villages that they're connected to through exogamous marriage, through marrying outside of their village into other villages to connect them so they can call upon them when it's time to go fight. Again, how we recognize kinship and descent systems, it categorizes who are your friends, who are your enemies, who do you marry, who do you not marry. It's a really important organizing principle for other societies. Pictures are just of the Yanomamo, and the bottom there is a Yanomamo village. They always have this big open space sort of in the middle. So that's exogamous marriage, marrying outside the group. That's one really important strategy the Yanomamo have for getting married. And it's a prescriptive rule, right? They know who to marry. There's another major strategy the Yanomamo have, and you want to understand both. It'll come up again. The other main strategy the Yanomamo have for getting married is related to endogamy. So remember we were talking about kinship and parallel and cross cousins. The Yanomamo recognize patrilineal descent, so the Iroquois kinship system, patrilineal descent, and they also practice something. So the kin line, the most important relatives, are traced through the males, patrilineal descent. They also practice something called bilateral cross cousin marriage, and they do this with both on the mother side and the father side. So back up to our kinship diagram. Here's Ego. Ego's father. Ego is in the patriline of his father. So is Ego's sister until she marries. When she marries, whoever she marries, she'll now enter that male's patriline. Ego will stay in this patriline. Whoever Ego marries will be joining his patriline, and the kids will also stay in the patriline until they get married. The sons will stay, the females will go. Ego's father. And then Ego's father-brother, also called father. And parallel cousins are also called sister-brother. These are in the patriline, same patriline as Ego, and you would never marry within your patriline, within your immediate family. However, Ego's father's sister is not in Ego's patriline. She belongs to this guy's patriline, and so do these kids, so do these cross cousins. They're not in Ego's patriline, they're not in his family. Same thing on the mother's side. Ego's mother's sister, those kids are parallel cousins. They're not in the patriline, but they're an important type of family. But the cross cousins on either side are never in the patriline. Ego's mother's brother, this brother belongs to his own patriline, the one the mother used to, but now she married into Ego's father's patriline. And so cross cousins, either Ego's mother's brother, daughter, or Ego's father's sister's daughter, are eligible marriage partners, and in fact, desirable marriage partners. So again, at least one set of parallel cousins belongs to the same kin group as Ego. The other set of parallel cousins is another type of family. But cross cousins don't. They don't belong to the same patriline. They're not considered family. So they're not only eligible marriage partners for Ego, but desirable. And one strategy among the Yanomamo is to marry cross cousins within the village to maintain village cohesion. It's called village endogamy. So remember, exogamy, they marry outside the village into other villages. In the case of village endogamy, they're marrying inside the village, but into different kin groups in the village. All Yanomami villages are made up of 2 or more kin groups. And so you marry your cross cousin, you marry outside your patriline, and into another patriline to tie the different kin groups, the different patrilines in the village together so that they work well together, that they cooperate together because they're all related. It helps create village cohesion. So they practice village endogamy, marrying cross cousins to accomplish that. Again, the kinship system in other societies can tell you who you can marry, who you can't, and a lot of times who you should marry. Oh, that just shows the parallel cousins and cross cousins. And again, parallel always in the family, but cross cousins never are. So here's actual Yanomami kin terms. So here's Ego again, our And we'll color it in, even though they didn't. This is our focal point. So in Yanomami, the ego's mother is Naya, and note mother sister also Naya. Ego's sister and brother Imiwa and Iwa. Also note ego's mother's sister's children are also called by sibling terms, brother sister, the same terms ego calls his actual brother sister in U.S. terms. Hopefully that made sense. Ego's mother's brother, however, belongs to his own patriline, the patriline the mother used to be in until she married Ego's father. And so this is a different type of relative, not in his own patriline. And these kids also belong to a different patriline. And note they're not called by sibling terms like the parallel cousins are. Cross cousins have different terms entirely. Right? Same thing on the father's side, Haya for the father. Father's brother is also Haya, and the father's sister has a different term. And it's not mom, and it's also not the same as what you would call the wife of this guy. Don't worry about what it is. It's just to sort of show you how this works. These are also cross cousins, not in the patriline. But note, the father's kids, also called brother and sister. You would call them father. You would call these people brother, sister. So you can, again, you can look at the terms to sort of tease out who's more important in the culture in terms of the kin system for the family. We'll just ego sister's kids, Taitaya and Hekamaya. So the sister's kids are called by different terms than Ego's kids and Ego's brother's kids. Note Ego's own biological children, daughter, son. They also calls his brother's children daughter and son. The sister, these maybe niece nephew. This would translate as the sister's kids. That's because she, even though you can't see it, she is married into a different patriline, and these kids belong to that patriline. Okay, so you can see how the kinship system varies drastically from different societies, and how, depending on if there's property and inheritance and other things going on, it plays a really key role in marriage patterns. In the US, we have just one strong prescriptive rule, what you should do, who you should marry, and that is get married. This is changing, but up until the last decade or so, there's pretty large social stigmatization on those that are not married. Like, oh, couldn't find someone that wanted to be with you, whatever, different stigmatizations on it. And so get married. Over 70% of men and women from the ages 25 to 44 have been married. 71% of men and 79% of women. And those that are married report having a greater sense of well-being. And I think, interestingly, are they better off? I mean, who knows? It probably depends on the person, but is it also the social stigmatization that comes with not being married that makes people feel better that they are married, right? We don't make our choices, and we don't experience our feelings in a vacuum, right? We're part of this, the social context that we grew up in. This is changing, though. There's less of a stigmatization. Hey, I'm not married, and I'm not 44, but not even close. Also, other things. We used to have some other sort of soft proscriptive rules, like who you're not supposed to marry. So prescriptive, who you should, proscriptive, who you should not marry. In the US, there used to be, again, a taboo on getting married, prescriptive. You can see this is changing. On the bottom, that teal color, less people are married than in the 1960s. That was almost 3/4. 2008, more like half. That top, never married, more and more people never been married. Divorce has also increased, so it's less stigmatized than it used to be. Many societies also have proscriptive rules. Like I was saying, proscriptive rules are who you should not marry. In the US, we have a few soft prescriptive rules. One used to be interracial marriage or interethnic marriage, although this is changing. And so remember from the film Race, the Power of an Illusion, where 100 years ago, I mean, it was like illegal and considered horrendous to marry outside of your so-called race. Remember, race is a social construct anyways. That's changing. That's breaking down. This shows from 1980 to 2010, newly married interracial, interethnic couples, and already married. And so that's gone up and up. There's been a few other soft proscriptive rules that are changing. Rules that say people that are not heterosexual cannot get married. That's changing, right? Marriage is a human right and should be treated as such. There's one sort of universal rule who you should not marry that. So we've been talking in terms of culturally specific rules and examples. The incest taboo, is one of those universal prescriptive rules. So incest refers to having sexual relations with relatives, family members, namely, especially biological relatives. And so by and large, there is a universal proscriptive taboo against intercourse or marriage with immediate relatives, people in your nuclear family, right? Your father, mother, sister, brother. However, it happens more than we think. Examples: some Inca leaders had to marry their daughters. The royal families in Europe, sort of pre-industrial revolution, often married within the family line to keep the bloodline pure, sort of this idea of the blue bloods. And actually, that has resulted in genetic abnormalities, disorders that reduce survival of individuals. And this is sort of one of the explanations for why we have a universal incest taboo, how it came to be. And so the example among the royal families in Europe, especially in England, they're breeding within their own family. And there's in your genetics, you inherit genes from your mother and your father. And there's something called recessive alleles. They're gene forms. Let's just say take the ability to roll your tongue. Okay, that's a dominant trait. So you get either the ability, you inherit a dominant trait for it from your mom and your dad. You can roll your tongue. Or if you were to get two recessive traits from each parent, you cannot roll your tongue. It's genetic. And so there's been some controversy, people saying that rolling your tongue doesn't work quite like that, although I still am going to use it as an example for Mendelian genetics. So what happens is, and let's just pretend not being able to roll your tongue is lethal, okay, even though it's not. If you are inheriting genetic material from your mom and your dad, and they're from different families, the chance for you to inherit two recessive alleles is pretty low. Because recessive alleles often are deadly or damaging. They lower the survival of individuals, and so they're not as prevalent in the genetics of the population because the individuals that have two copies of them don't usually make it to reproduction. And so if you are mating with people in your family, and that family, that lineage has recessive alleles in it, the likelihood for the offspring to inherit two recessive alleles rather than just one or none, as long as you have just one normal one, you're still usually okay from the disorders it can cause. But when you start breeding with family and you have recessive disorders in your family, the chance for the offspring to inherit those recessive alleles, two copies of it, becomes a lot higher. And so in the royal families in Europe, through inbreeding, a disorder called hemophilia emerged. And it's a recessive disorder, but basically the individual's blood doesn't clot. So if they bump their knee on a table or get a cut or a scrape, they can essentially bleed to death because their blood can't clot. And this is a disorder that came from interbreeding between close family members that shared recessive genetic alleles. You start breeding with close family that shares these same alleles as you, the chances of inheriting two of them become much higher. And so that's why incest and inbreeding can reduce fitness, survival, genetic fitness. But again, it's happened. Another example, the pharaohs in ancient Egypt used to sometimes marry their siblings. The other thing is there's exceptions, so it does happen sometimes, but also how we define incest varies. How many of you would consider first cousin marriage here in the US incest? Think about it for a sec and take a guess. How many of you think first cousin marriage is illegal in the US? Think about it. First cousin marriage in the US is legal in a lot of different states. So we do have a taboo on incest, but again, the way we define it varies for certain states in the US, California being one of them. Incest is not illegal, it's legal. Um, Likewise, the Yanomamo, they marry their cross cousins, and that is not considered incest by them either because they don't consider their cross cousins family, even though the biological relationship is the same as it would be, say, here. And so how it's defined and recognized varies because of the way people recognize family varies. So incest taboos are essentially universal with immediate relatives, but beyond that, the definitions vary. Anytime we see something that pops up among all humans, all societies, it begs the question if there's a biological and evolutionary basis for that. Is this incest taboo, this lack of desire to mate with close relatives, is that biologically determined? Is it built into our genes? Is that why we see it across the entire species for the most part? Or is it socially determined? Is it something we all learn via enculturation and growing up? Your book gives 4 hypotheses. We're interested in the last 2 only, which taken together are capable of explaining the universality of the incest taboo. The first is inbreeding avoidance, which I've already alluded to. This is the idea that breeding with close relatives reduces one's genetic fitness. It increases the likelihood for disorders and recessive alleles to pop up in the offspring and cause lethal or fatal mutations or problems for that individual. And so your fitness, your likelihood of survival and reproduction is reduced when you inbreed. And so natural selection would not favor individuals that breed with their relatives, right? Would select against that. Um, those that do breed with their relatives will be less fit, have less survival advantages in their environment, and be less likely to pass their genes on to future generations. Those that do not mate with relatives, more likely to pass their genes on. But how the hell do you know sort of who's your relative and who's not? And so the fourth or the second reason that we'll talk about is the childhood familiarity hypothesis. So inbreeding avoidance, it reduces your genetic fitness, so don't mate with relatives. But how do you know who your relatives are? The childhood familiarity hypothesis says males and females that are closely associated during childhood, people that grow up together, that are sort of raised together, have very little sexual desire for each other once they grow up. There's actually several different studies that support this. One example for you is the kibbutzim of Israel, pictured here. And it's these children that were raised in communal nurseries in Israel. The idea of sort of raise them together and even actually encourage them to sort of be interested in one another when they grew up. But the kids that were raised together tended to not be interested in one another sexually. Um, and so the childhood familiarity hypothesis holds that those that you are familiar with, that you spend a lot of time with and grow up with, typically you're not sexually interested in. And so how do you know who to avoid inbreeding with so that it doesn't reduce your genetic fitness? How do I know who's in my family? Well, typically those that are in your family are those that you're raised with, that you grow up with. So the 2 reasons taken together are sort of capable of explaining why we see this taboo um, universally, and also why we see the exceptions, right? Because the Yanomamo, for example, they don't define cross cousins as family, and you're also not raised with your cross cousins. They belong to an entirely different patriline. So that wouldn't be considered incest, even though the genetic consequences are sort of the same. Okay, so that's one of those proscriptive rules, who you shouldn't marry, that sort of applies on this broad level. It has some biological basis to it. I hope you kind of found some of the material on kinship and marriage interesting. I wish we could have talked about it in class, but if you have any questions about any of it, please do get in touch. You have one other very short piece of material for this week, which is an introduction to our last topic for the week, identity, starting with ethnicity. So that kinship and marriage, and also the wrap up on exchange, that's the material for the week. After you watch the brief intro lecture on ethnicity, only 10 minutes or less, you're going to watch a film about ethnicity called Becoming American. So see the next lecture, lecture 16, for that intro and the link to the film. I hope you enjoy it. The quiz for this week's material will be available by this evening. You are welcome to do it tonight or this weekend. You can work over the break if you want, but I'm going to extend your due date for quiz number 4 on this material till the Tuesday after we return from break. So it will be due April 7th rather than April 5th. The idea is if you want to go ahead and get through this, get it done, or do it over the break, you totally can, but I don't want you to have to work over the break. You guys deserve a break and you should take one. So you also have till Tuesday to sort of cover everything and make sure you take the quiz by noon on Tuesday, the Tuesday we return after spring break. So like 10 days from today. Okay, get in touch with me if you have questions. I hope you guys get a bit of a rest, a bit of a break. Don't forget there's also lecture 16 in the film that concludes the week's material after this one. All right, we made it through online number 2. You guys take care of yourselves. Definitely take a break over spring break. You deserve it. See ya.